The storm came in fast, as frontier storms often did, without warning and without mercy. Wind tore across the open land, bending the tall grass flat, as rain followed in hard, slanted sheets. The sky darkened to a bruised purple, and thunder rolled low, not cracking but growling, as if the earth itself were uneasy. Out here, storms didn't just pass through. They claimed things. The woman saw them from the window of her cabin, a shape first, then many, shadows moving where no one should be moving at dusk. 7 riders broke through the curtain of rain, their horses massive, steady, unfazed by the weather. They rode in a tight line, silhouettes carved against lightning flashes. Each carried weapons that glinted wet and cold. No shouting, no signal, just the sound of hooves beating time with the thunder. She had lived alone for years, long enough to know that 7 armed riders appearing at her door was never an accident. Her first instinct was flight, but there was nowhere to go. The storm had erased the trail. The nearest neighbor was half a day's ride on a clear morning, and this was anything but clear. She reached for the rifle by the door, then stopped. A rifle might protect her from one man, not 7. They slowed as they reached the cabin. One rider lifted a hand, and the others halted instantly. Discipline, that alone sent a deeper chill through her than the rain ever could. The leader dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud, rain running down his dark hair and shoulders. He raised his empty hands, showing her his palms through the glass. There was a knock, not hard, not threatening, just firm. "Storm bad," he said, voice low-measured. "We need shelter, only for night." Her heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. Every story she'd ever heard about raids, about disappearances, about women alone on the frontier, came rushing back at once. 7 men, 1 cabin, 1 woman. She moved closer to the door despite herself, close enough to see their faces now. Hard, weathered, unreadable. One of them stood slightly apart from the others, watching her with an intensity that felt different. Not hunger, not menace, something quieter. He said nothing. Her hand closed around the latch. Outside, thunder cracked close enough to rattle the walls. Inside, the fire flickered, casting long, uncertain shadows. She knew, with a clarity that scared her, that this moment would divide her life cleanly in 2. One choice: open the door, and trust the storm had brought more than death, or keep it closed, and face whatever came next alone. The door opened just wide enough to let the storm scream inside. Rain and dust followed the 7 riders as they stepped across her threshold, water streaming from braided hair and soaked hides. One by one, they lowered their weapons, not surrendering them, just setting them within reach. Steel and would kiss the floor with quiet finality. The woman's cabin felt smaller with each breath they took, the fire shrinking back as if it knew better than to challenge them. They stood where she pointed, backs to the walls, eyes moving. No one spoke. The leader, broad-shouldered, scarred, older than the rest, studied her as if weighing grain. His gaze wasn't cruel. It was careful. He gave a short nod, a signal, and the others followed his lead. Cloaks loosened, horse skins thudding outside. The storm kept at bay by 4 rough walls and a single door that would not hold long if tested. Night pressed in. Thunder rolled low, like hooves beneath the earth. The woman busied herself with the kettle, hands steady only because she forced them to be. She felt their eyes on her back. She felt the question in the room, why she had opened the door at all. Hunger had taught her to read men, and these men were tired. Dangerous, yes, but desperate too. They spoke among themselves in murmurs, clipped and controlled, words she did not understand. Silence grew heavy between those sounds. Fear lived in that silence. So did restraint. The leader finally spoke to her in broken trade tongue. "Storm passes. We go." A promise, or a warning. She answered with a nod, matching his economy. Then she noticed the one who stood apart. He kept near the door, half-turned, watching the dark through the cracks. Younger than the leader, taller than the rest, his eyes never left the window. When she set a cup near him, he didn't reach for it until she stepped away. When he did, his hand shook, just once. He caught it. He met her eyes, not boldly, not submissively. Conflicted. The fire popped. Outside, the storm locked them together. Inside, trust did not arrive, but neither did violence. Not yet. The night stretched long inside the cabin, fire snapping low while rain worried the roof, like restless fingers. Words were scarce. What passed between them came in glances, in the careful placement of hands, in the way bodies chose where to sit. The woman moved with practiced quiet, measuring water, breaking bread, setting it where it could be taken without reaching. Years alone had taught her how to survive without sound. Loss had taught her how to endure without asking. When she worked, fragments of her life surfaced in motion. A scar along her wrist spoke of wire and cold. The way she checked the door twice spoke of nights when no one came, then nights when someone did. She did not explain how the land had taken her husband, or how the neighbors had thinned and vanished, or why she stayed when leaving might have been easier. The cabin itself told it. Repairs made from mismatched wood, tools worn smooth by one set of hands, a table set for one that still made room for more. The 7 riders carried themselves like a storm broken into pieces. One leaned too close to the fire, hunger sharp in his eyes. Another watched the walls as if expecting them to move. A third tested the silence, fingers brushing the haft of a blade, impatience coiled tight. Their leader spoke only when needed, voice low, the words careful, as though each one cost something. They were wary, yes, but not of her alone. Of the land. Of what followed them. Of what the night remembered. Then there was the quiet warrior. He did not crowd the fire or test the room. He noticed the cracked hinge and fixed it without being asked, using wire from his own kit. He split wood with measured blows and stacked it dry, turning the ends away from the rain. When the kettle tipped, he righted it before it spilled, eyes never leaving the task. Respect showed in the way he waited for her nod before moving through her space, in how he placed his weapons out of reach and kept them there. The bond formed not from speech, but from work shared. She showed him where the boards bowed in winter. He showed her how to brace them. She marked the trails that flooded. He traced the higher ground with a finger in the dust. In the quiet, injustice surfaced on both sides, the taking of land, the breaking of promises, the way fear wore different faces, but cut the same. Neither asked for pity. Neither offered apology. They stood together at the door when the wind rose, shoulders aligned, watching the dark. By the time the fire burned down to coals, something had changed. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. 2 lives shaped by staying, when leaving would have been safer. 2 kinds of loneliness, learning the weight of another presence. Outside, the storm pressed on. Inside, a fragile understanding took root, thin as a flame, but alive. The storm had begun to loosen its grip, but the night outside the cabin felt tighter than before. The woman noticed it first, not a sound, but the absence of one. No wind through the grass. No distant thunder. Just a stillness so heavy it pressed against the walls. She stepped to the narrow window and peered into the dark, lantern light trembling in her hand. Shapes moved where no shape should be. Horses. Men. Waiting. The Comanche leader rose in a single fluid motion, every trace of rest gone from his posture. He did not rush. He did not shout. He listened, eyes narrowed, head tilted as if the earth itself were speaking to him. Then he looked at her, and for the first time there was no distance in his gaze, only truth. "They follow us," he said plainly. "They will not pass you by now." His words were not a threat. They were a warning carved clean and sharp. Her breath caught. The realization struck harder than fear. By opening her door, she had stepped into a war that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with survival. The land she had defended alone for years was no longer invisible. If the riders outside chose violence, they would burn her home without asking her name. She thought of the quiet mornings she'd earned with stubborn endurance, and how quickly they could vanish. That was when the quiet warrior moved. He crossed the room and gently took the lantern from her shaking hand, setting it lower so its glow wouldn't betray the cabin. His voice, when it came, was low and careful as if unused. "You should not stand near the window," he said. Not command. Concern. He met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. An apology, perhaps, or a promise. Outside, a horse snorted. Leather creaked. A voice carried faintly through the dark. The Comanche leader turned back to his men, issuing soft instructions. There would be no leaving now. No pretending this was a passing storm. The door she had opened could not be closed again. And as the cabin fell into a tense, deliberate silence, the woman understood the cost of mercy on the frontier. Once you chose a side, the night remembered. Night pressed in tight around the cabin, the storm still muttering across the land like something unwilling to leave. Inside, the air changed. Fear gave way to motion. No one spoke much. Words weren't needed now. Survival had its own language. The woman moved first. She dragged a heavy table toward the narrow window, bracing it with practiced strength. Another shutter was wedged tight with a fence post, with groaning under the pressure. She knew her cabin's weak points the way a wounded animal knows its scars. The riders watched her work, surprised not by her resolve, but by her certainty. This was not panic. This was preparation. The Comanche moved with quiet efficiency. One checked the perimeter through a crack in the wall. Another laid out weapons with deliberate care, rifles resting beside bows, arrows straightened, knives set where hands could find them in the dark. Firelight was lowered until only a dull glow remained, shadows stretching long across the floor. Outside, they wanted darkness. Inside, they would give it to them. The quiet warrior stepped beside her, without a word. He took the hammer from her hands, tested the nail with his thumb, then drove it in clean and sure. Their eyes met for a moment, hers steady, his searching. No smile, no gesture, just understanding. When he handed the hammer back, his fingers lingered half a second longer than necessary. It was enough. She noticed how he listened, not just to the sounds outside, but to the land itself, the wind, the silence between thunderclaps. She followed his gaze, trusting it without knowing why. When he gestured toward the rear of the cabin, she nodded and moved, already thinking 3 steps ahead. That cabin was no longer hers alone. It was a position, and they were defending it together. A kettle was pulled from the fire, water shared in silence. One of the riders offered her a strip of dried meat. She hesitated, then took it. Not gratitude. Respect. The unspoken kind that's earned when fear doesn't break you. For a brief moment, everything slowed. Outside, hoofbeats whispered somewhere beyond the trees. Inside, breaths were measured. Hands steadied. 7 warriors and 1 woman, no longer strangers trapped by a storm, but allies bound by the same hard truth. If the night came for them, it would not take them easily. And as the fire dimmed and the cabin settled into stillness, something fragile but real took hold. Not trust born of words, trust born of action, of standing shoulder to shoulder when it mattered most. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. The first shot cracked through the storm like the splitting of the world itself. It came from the dark tree line, unseen and merciless, slamming into the cabin wall just above the window. Wood exploded inward. Splinters rained across the floor. In an instant, the fragile stillness shattered, replaced by chaos and instinct. The woman was already moving, dropping low as another shot followed, then another, measured, deliberate. These were not drunken raiders. These were hunters. The Comanche warriors reacted as one. Weapons were in their hands before the echoes faded. The leader barked a sharp command, and bodies flowed into position. 2 at the windows, 1 at the door, others slipping out through the back like ghosts born of smoke and rain. Outside, silhouettes flickered between lightning strikes. Riders, at least a dozen, maybe more. They had come to wipe the slate clean. Arrows hissed through the rain, striking wood and flesh alike. A warrior fell hard near the fire pit, grunting once before dragging himself behind cover. The woman fired from the window, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. She wasn't thinking anymore. This was her home. Every board, every nail, hers to defend. Fear burned away, replaced by something colder. Resolve. The attackers surged closer, using the storm as their ally. Shadows rushed the cabin. Gunfire thundered back and forth, flashes lighting faces twisted with intent. One man reached the door, only to be met by a blade flashing in firelight. He fell without a sound, swallowed by mud and rain. Then the back wall burst inward. A rider crashed through, splintering planks, rolling into the cabin with a howl. The woman spun, raising her rifle, but the quiet warrior was already there. He moved like a force of nature, striking with brutal precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The rider never stood a chance. More poured in behind him. The fight turned savage, close, personal. The air filled with smoke, blood, and the sharp metallic scent of fear. A Comanche warrior went down near the hearth, another dragging him back as bullets tore through the space they'd occupied moments before. The woman was shoved behind an overturned table, the quiet warrior placing himself between her and the chaos, without a word. A bullet grazed a shoulder. He didn't slow. Outside, the storm roared louder, as if the land itself was screaming. Fire caught along the roof, where a lantern had shattered. Flames licked upward, threatening to consume the cabin whole. The attackers pressed harder, sensing victory in destruction. "Go!" the leader shouted, one word, filled with command. But the quiet warrior didn't move. Instead, he turned back to her. For the first time since they'd met, his eyes locked fully onto hers, not guarded, not distant. Clear, certain. He spoke then, his voice low but fierce, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Stay down." Then he charged back into the fire. He fought like a man who had already decided the outcome. Arrows flew. Guns roared. Bodies fell in the mud. One attacker tried to flank through the smoke. He never made it past the blade waiting in the dark. Another aimed at the woman through a broken wall. The quiet warrior took the shot meant for her, staggering but staying upright, fury driving him forward. The tide began to turn. The attackers hesitated. What they thought was an easy kill had become a slaughter. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected unity. They hadn't expected her. With a final coordinated push, the Comanche warriors forced the remaining riders back into the storm. A last shot rang out, then silence, broken only by rain, crackling fire, and labored breathing. The woman stood slowly, ears ringing, heart hammering. The cabin was wrecked. Smoke curled into the night. Bodies lay still in the mud. And there, in the firelight, the quiet warrior dropped to one knee. She rushed to him, pressing her hands against the wound, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. He looked up at her, rain streaking his face, and for the first time, allowed himself a small, exhausted smile. The storm began to fade. Firelight flickered against the ruined walls, illuminating what remained, not just of the cabin, but of them. They had survived, together, and nothing on that land would ever be the same again. The storm broke just before dawn, not all at once, but slowly, as if the land itself were catching its breath. Smoke drifted low across the ground, mixing with mist and rain-soaked earth. The attackers were gone now, some carried away by the dark, others left where they fell. What remained was silence, thick, uneasy, and absolute. The woman stood outside her cabin, boots sinking into the mud she had walked for years alone. The walls were scarred, the door splintered, but it still stood, and so did she. The Comanche riders moved quietly, gathering their fallen, tending wounds with practiced hands. Their leader spoke softly, words she didn't understand, but the meaning carried clear enough. Their presence had saved her, and now it endangered her. They would ride on at first light. The quiet warrior lingered apart from the others, rainwater tracing lines down his braids. He looked at the cabin, not as shelter now, but as something more, a place where he had been seen without threat, where he had spoken without force, where a life different from the one carved into him by blood and war had briefly been possible. He approached her once more. No grand speech, no promises, just a long look, heavy with everything that could not be said. His people were calling. Duty, history, survival pulling him back. And yet something remained between them, rooted deeper than fear. The sun rose over the plains, washing the land in pale gold. Steam lifted from the ground. The storm had taken much, but it had also cleared the air. As the riders mounted and turned away, the woman felt the weight of loneliness shift. She was alone again, but not the same. The land was scarred, the cabin worn. Yet something new stood where fear once lived, a quiet strength born of choice. What remained after the storm was not emptiness. It was possibility. Out on the frontier, justice wasn't written in books or spoken from clean halls. It lived in moments like this, when fear rode up to your door, asking not for mercy, but for shelter. Opening that door took more than courage. It took faith in something deeper than survival. She had lived alone so long that loneliness felt safer than hope. And yet, when danger arrived wearing unfamiliar faces, she chose not to turn away. That choice changed everything, because the frontier has a way of testing who we are, not by the enemies we fight, but by the strangers we choose to trust. So I'll ask you now, as the fire burns low and the night grows quiet, what would you have done? When fear knocked, armed and uncertain, would you have barred the door or opened it, knowing the cost might be high? If this story stirred something in you, leave your thoughts here, where voices still matter. And if you wish to keep walking these hard frontier roads with us, through tales of justice, risk, and unexpected bonds, then subscribe and stay close. The cabin glows warm now against the dark. She is no longer alone. And all because, once, she chose to open the door.